Bookseller Crow on the box. Tales from an empty bookshop.
Action. Thank you. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the next Bookseller Crow Talk from an Empty Bookshop. And tonight we have Michèle Roberts and Helen Cullen joining us to discuss their latest books. And I'm really excited to have them both here together, because we've been trying to arrange something for some time, haven't we, Helen? Michèle is an old friend of the bookshop, came for a night with Sheena McKay a couple of years ago, and we said then we'd love to have her back. So this has finally happened, and very excited. So Michèle Roberts is half English and half French. I'm not sure which half is which, but the author of many critically acclaimed novels, including Daughters of the House, which was shortlisted for the Booker in 1992. She is Emeritus Professor of Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et Lettres. I think I've said that right, my best French. The Times says, to read a book by Roberts is to savour colour, sound, taste, texture, and touch as never before. And the Sunday Times says Roberts is at her best when she writes about food and sex, feelings and desires that cut across boundaries of time and class. In your latest book, Michèle, Negative Capability, which is a diary of surviving, that's the other line to it, you have written an honest memoir about the year after your novel was rejected by your then publisher, but it is also a memoir about friendship, survival and resilience, and it's based in both Walworth and your house in Mayenne in France. It is also about your identity and status as a single woman, independent, alone and yet rarely lonely, and it is marvellous.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
And Helen Cullen, is an Irish writer living in London, not South London, I fear.
Not anymore, but I was in Clapham for a long time, so yeah.
You're
gone a bit
honorary,
farther away.
honorary South London. Her debut novel, The Lost Letters of William Wolfe, was shortlisted for Newcomer of the Year at the Irish Book Awards and has been optioned for television. Helen freelances for the Sunday Times magazine and is a regular feature writer and book reviewer for the Irish Times. Your latest book, your second book, The Truth Must Dazzle Gradually, is a celebration of the complex, flawed and stubbornly optimistic human heart. It has been said. That hasn't just come out of me. And The Independent says of your writing that Cullen's writing is precise, haunting and above all beautiful. Her description, and this is about this novel in particular, her descriptions from the minutiae of the moon's home to the mood of the nearby sea are masterfully constructed. However, it is the author's attention to the complexities of human emotion and their various expressions that really marks The Truth Must Dazzle Gradually as a book of rare quality. And I happen to agree with that, because it's such an emotionally engaging book, but we will talk a little bit more about that in a while, I hope. So before we go on to hearing from your books, I just want to ask how you both are, and am I the first person you've seen in a long time?
Well, I actually was in quarantine for 2 weeks, just out of it, because I dashed across to France, and while I was there I learned that I'd have to quarantine when I got back. And quarantine was deeply horrible and very lonely and extremely unhappy and quite mad. So I'm feeling quite wonderful to be let out and to have come to lovely Crystal Palace and your lovely bookshop and to see lovely Helen.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm very lucky that I have my man at home who's kept me company during lockdown, Damien, or as my mother says, poor Damien. I haven't really been out that much. We've been living a very quiet existence, but I suppose the wryly life is a quiet existence a lot of the time anyway, but everything like this feels just giddy now to be out and doing things. We'd no idea how glamorous and exciting our lives were before all of this, I now realise, so it's a real treat to be here.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for coming. So would you mind taking it in turns? This is a first because we've got two authors and it's very exciting. So taking it in turns, so I don't know who wants to go first to read from the book and perhaps say a few words about it if you want to. If not, we can just discuss it after. So.
It's always difficult to do readings because if it's a novel you feel you have to explain the plot, and if it's not a novel you don't know what to read. So I think I'll just read a few lines and then explain them possibly. Chapter 1, April. One day in Orchard Street, London. Yesterday ended in disaster. Very late at night, I decided to write down everything that had happened. The only way I could think of coping. So here goes. I think I'll stop there. The point is that the yesterday ended in disaster because I lost the plot completely of my life. I was lying in bed, pretty unhappy because it had been a day of disasters, small disasters that had suddenly all added up and ended in me crashing. And I was lying in bed and I suddenly realised I didn't know who I was, where I was, what time of day it was, what was going on. I'd completely disintegrated and it was frightening. It felt like being a thing tossed in a stormy sea. I'd crashed somehow. There was no I. And all I could see was these sort of spars of stuff floating past that eventually seemed to be words. And I realised, although I couldn't even think, that if I could write down everything that happened, I would therefore be making a narrative. And through making a narrative of that day that had passed, I might start to reassemble a self. So the book really began as self-rescue. I didn't think about publishing it at all. It was just a diary to help myself have a self. And I wrote it and wrote it and wrote it. And I wrote one day every month for a year because I thought, although I began quite quickly to feel better, I thought, I might disintegrate again. I might fall apart again. It's perfectly possible. So I kept going for a year. And because I'm in a small writers group, I was very helped by showing what I'd written to the two other writers in the writers group. And eventually they said, this could make a book. And I thought, oh God, who wants to read about a writer going mad overnight? They said, well, give it a whirl. So
turns out quite a
all
few.
Of us, yeah. Everybody desperately needs to read it.
Yes, we'll talk about it. Perhaps we'll talk about it after you've introduced your book. Do you think that would be a
yes,
good
sure.
order?
Okay.
Even though you have left us on a cliffhanger.
Absolutely. Well, maybe I'll just read a paragraph from the first chapter where we begin on a little island off the west coast of Ireland, a fictional island called Inishogue, and it's 2005. And this just introduces the protagonist, Murta, and his wife, Maeve. Murta had woken that morning, once again, to an empty bed. The sheets were cold and unruffled on Maeve's side. He had expected to find her sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in her houndstooth shawl, pale and thin in the darkness before dawn. A tangle of blue-black hair swept across her high forehead like a crow's wet wing, her long matted curls secured in a knot at the nape of her neck with one of her red pencils. He had anticipated how she would start when he appeared in the doorway, how he would ignore, as he always did, the few moments it would take for her dove-grey eyes to turn their focus outward, for the ghost to leave her in his presence. The kettle would hiss and spit on the stove as they stood behind her wicker chair and rubbed warmth back into her arms, his voice jolly as he gently scolded her for lack of sleep and feigned nonchalance as to its cause. But Maeve wasn't sitting at the kitchen table, nor was she meditating on the stone step of the back door, drinking milk straight from the glass bottle it was delivered in. She wasn't dozing on the living room sofa, the television on but silent, an empty crystal tumbler tucked inside the pocket of her peacock blue silk dressing gown, the one in which she had painstakingly embroidered a murmuration of starlings in the finest silver thread. Instead, there was an empty space on the banister where her coat should have been hanging.
It's a very good introduction to Maeve. Yes, there's a lot to talk about in both the books. Maeve is a character who, well, maybe you'd like to explain a little bit more about Maeve and how you went about researching her mental health and things like that.
Yes, well, I suppose where we open in the novel, it's sort of at the culmination of Maeve's journey with her mental health problems, and then we go back in the second chapter to the late 70s when we see Maeve and Myrta, the two characters that I just read about, meeting for the first time, and their life is unfolding before them. And so we catch up in time through the first half of the book to that same fateful evening on Christmas Eve that we meet in the first chapter, and hopefully by then, you know, as the reader, there might be more understanding about why what happens on that night would have to come to happen, and then from there it progresses forward in time until present day, and we see the consequences on the family going forward and how they moved on and didn't move on, and the impact that it had on the children of Maeve and Myrta throughout their adult years. So
yes, it's a very well, I read that it's a structure used a lot in crime novels.
So I hear.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I saw it as you might have talked about this in when you're teaching writing, Michèle, that it's the E structure, where something's...
I've never heard of it.
No, well,
tell us.
Well, it's if you imagine an E, it starts here and then the story loops back on itself and then continues on beyond that moment.
That would have been so helpful as an image to have in my mind.
Well, I know. Well, I assumed because someone was like, "Oh, well, that's just the E structure." I'm like, "Gosh, clearly we all should have known that at school."
When anyone asks me in the future, though, I'll say, "Well, I have deployed an interesting structure called the E that you may have."
It's interesting because it does connect to something I think of as the therapy structure,
right?
Which is that a novel sometimes opens with a problem, particularly one set in a family, and then it jumps backwards and you see possibly what might have triggered problems in a childhood or the past, and then the novel jumps right forwards. But I'm going to call it the E structure. Fantastic.
Thank you, Karen.
Well, I'm pleased I know it's the therapy structure because we can just say, well, of course.
Of course.
Both. There we go. So let's talk about your books a bit more. But first of all, I'm going to ask you how you both came to know each other, because you're not just randomly here in the same room as two wonderful authors. You actually do know each other. And I think have a professional kind of mentor-mentee relationship. Is that correct? Or is that just unofficial?
Yeah. Well, I started teaching. The Guardian newspaper was running masterclasses in writing. Of course, I might want to call them mistress classes, but that means something else, because femininity and masculinity are not equal terms, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, there I was, very happily teaching, I think just several years running. It was always a small group, and it was a very committed professional setup. It was, people who wanted to write novels and were prepared to work immensely hard. And I was absolutely delighted that I met Helen on one of those courses, because you were just such a wonderful writer. And I recognised almost immediately, I think, the quality of your language, your poetic language and your poetic imagination and your fire and fury and commitment and wanting to make beautiful things. And I just loved working with you because of that commitment, but also because of your talent. So for me, it's been pure delight and joy knowing Helen.
Fantastic. There you go.
Oh gosh, thank you so much, Michèle. The truth is, when you read out that little bit from The Independent, all I was thinking when I was sitting here was, if a word of that is true, it is all thanks to this woman sitting beside me. Especially when you say about precision. Oh my goodness! I think everything I gave to Michèle to read, she wrote back and said, "Be precise, Helen. Compression."
No, the thing was, you had this wonderful imagination. you have a real poet's imagination in that you could take flight like a lark soaring, and you could connect everything in webs of wonderful words and images. And all I was doing was reining you in a bit because I knew that you wanted to write narrative, and that is different from the sort of webbing of poetic imagery which you just kind of gave to the world. And what you began to work on was how you translated that into story and narrative. And I just feel thrilled for you that you just came through and took off, and here you are.
Here you are together.
Honestly, it really, I don't say this lightly, but there is no way I would have ever written my first book if it hadn't been for Michèle. I started that workshop and I hadn't written a word, and I remember we had 2 weeks before we had to submit our first, whichever thousands of words to read, and I spent 13 and a half days panicking and thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? I mean, had never tried to write a short story, had never tried to write a poem, I kept journals and letters and things like that, but the idea of trying to write fiction was terrifying to me. And Michèle was terrifying to me. And I thought, I can't show up to this woman and not give her anything to read. And on the Sunday night before it was due in, I sat down and I wrote 2,000 or 3,000 words that ended up being the first chapter of my first book. And I remember we went in for feedback that week and I felt absolutely sick, thinking, how have I ended up in this room, and what are these people going to say to me? And they probably just feel really sorry for me, that I've, taken on this class and I'm so out of my depth. And I remember when, Michèle delivered her feedback, which was so kind and encouraging, as it always was, I just sort of stopped really even being able to hear anything and just felt myself welling up going, oh my goodness, this might be okay. And Michèle could see, I think, that I was, getting upset, and she said to me, but just ignore all that. All of this is just to say, Helen, you must keep going. And I think that was sort of the mantra every week then, for the 6 months we were together, just having this incredible woman, this amazing writer and mentor to just give you that encouragement every week. It's just a blessing in my life, and I never ever would have gotten to the end without it. It's terrifying to me how easily this mightn't have been my life. So yes, I owe it all to Michèle.
Goodness, it was, and it is. So do you still share your work with?
Yes.
Yeah.
So Michèle was the first person to read the first draft of this book, and she saved it from me and from myself, and we gave me amazing feedback. And something Michèle always does, which is so incredible somehow, is ask these incredible questions that allow you to reveal to yourself, all the things that you need the book to do, and what what you think but you're afraid to admit to yourself. And one of the most incredible things about the class we were in was that even though it was a class where people were trying to write novels, we never talked about publishing. We never talked about the industry, or even, it feels like we must have talked about technical things, like we obviously did, consider your point of view or whatever. But it felt like so much more provocative than that we were doing something much more meaningful than trying to produce an end product, but just trying to sort of find a way to access our interior life and not be afraid of our rage and our emotion and our subconscious. And I mean, that's just an incredible thing to have somebody
I think
support
I
you in that.
remember seeing you tweet a series of advice from Michèle Roberts.
Yes, I did. Yeah,
and I saved it all so that I could share it with some of my wryly friends. And one of them was about making art rather than worrying looking to be what an agent or a publisher is looking for, because that's kind of the wrong way round to approach fiction writing.
Yes.
And do you still think, is that what you still live by?
Yes, it is. It really is, because when I was a young writer, things were quite tough for young beginning writers. I mean, there was the bottom line is always how are you going to earn the living, and that's completely crucial. But there's also the problem of, will anyone understand it or get it or want it? And so you've got to find a way of having enough self-belief to keep going. But I think there was a sense when I was young, that was a long time ago, that there was a kind of literary world which believed in something called literary values and, I don't know, good literature. And now we're living in a very different world, I think, where literary value has been rather squished in terms of commercial value, and an awful lot of agents and publishers are just pure capitalists. They just want new product. They want beautiful new debut novelists, and the poor debut novelists are being told they've got to write books really fast and deliver product, and agents have become like publishers and are giving advice all the time and do this, do that, do that. And I don't think the discussion of literary values happens nearly so much. So things are much, much tougher now. But I still believe that writers are artists, and our duty to ourselves, if you like, and to our love of language and to our love of the form is to make the best book we possibly can make. That's it. That's what we've got to do, and we must believe in that. And then other things, let's hope they take care of themselves to some extent. But if the writer doesn't write the best book she possibly can, she's in for trouble, I think.
Yes, and I think trouble with herself as well. If something is rushed and pushed out as well too soon, perhaps, or even not quite where they know. I think one of the aspects of this book is about identity, and I wanted to get that in as well, because I know we're going to talk about the female character in Maeve, who I really want to talk about, but your identity and your definition of it to me was really interesting to think about, not only to do with the female gaze that you sort of write, which I could have much more writing on because of it reminded me of being at art college with John Berger and that whole idea of women being watched, and men watching and women watching themselves being watched, but also your identity and how fixed to your identity was as a writer in this particular time, and how feminist you are, and strident and wonderful in that. And I think that it was all mixed together, and you were kind of at a particular point, there was a point where as a writer you decided that you couldn't identify as a writer in that particular day that you wrote. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about identity. I'm sorry I've gone round the houses.
My generation of writers, of women writers, I think we were very interested in trying to represent female subjectivity, and we felt arrogantly, as you must do when you're young, that all the great male writers hadn't got it right, or some of them had got it better than others because they loved women more and were closer to them and understood them, like James Joyce, for example. He's really good on women, I think. But a lot of them, it was just cliches and stereotypes. Anyway, there we were saying, we are going to show the world female subjectivity. So that was that feminist impulse of finding a truth to tell, but it wasn't necessarily a personal, subjective truth. It was a truth of art. It was a truth made through art. That's a particular kind of truth. I pursued that for many years through telling what felt like new stories, or taking old stories and rewriting them, taking the Bible, rewriting the Old Testament, rewriting the New Testament, taking figures of male writers from the past like Flaubert or Mallarmé, retelling their stories from the point of view of the women they loved. So I think my identity as a writer was always bound up with this idea of trying to tell different stories and explore difference. But then I've looked back over my life and I've realised about every 15 years or so I have a crisis. And I've come to see, always afterwards, a lot of the time, when I just think I'm going mad, that I'm somehow like a chrysalis, just breaking open, splitting apart for some new creature to struggle out. So this latest crisis of thinking it was all quite personal, I'm just having a nervous breakdown, oh dear, it took on another meaning about what is it to be an older woman who's now 70, I think I was when I wrote that book. What does it mean to be living in what's called a post-feminist world, a world where older women aren't seen as mattering, where young women are commodified more than ever, where people like me with long backlists aren't particularly valued because the only thing that matters is the new. And so the breakdown took on the overnight breakdown took on a kind of resonance about, okay, I've got to reinvent myself, and maybe I've become a little bit rigid about I am a writer, and maybe I could just let go of stuff and realise I've got many selves, which is what the book is exploring. So there's a writer she's a friend and she's a lover, she's an ex-lover, she's an ex-wife, she's a daughter, she's a cook, she's a gardener, she's a roamer in London, she's a flâneuse. And that seemed to be the way forward. So what writing the book helped me to see was that what I'd seen as this disintegrated, scattered self could actually be cherished, in that it was perhaps easier to live like that, all these bits that didn't always connect, rather than thinking I've got to have a self and that's called a writer. So it was very liberating to have that overnight breakdown, because it showed me that, okay, I'm moving into a new phase of my life and I don't know what it'll be like, and I've got to find it out and invent it.
Well, this book to me was the perfect company. It was like, I know I don't know you very well, but it was like sitting with you, and I found it immensely entertaining and surprising, and I wanted anchovies a lot through it, because you described food as if it's being presented to you on, but mostly it was like being with a friend, being with you and your friends as well. It was like the way it's marketed, in a way, is kind of misleading, because
I agree.
It's not all about, it's hardly really about the idea of failure, and it's about a great life that's a success. And it's almost, when you do get to those sort of intensely painful moments, they're almost like sort of slithers of shiny fish cut in through this other big world that is your life. And I just thought that was really well done. It would be a very different memoir in different hands, and I think I'm grateful that it was in yours, because I'm sure this is not a unique story in the life of a novelist.
No.
In the sense of, but I think it is unique, or it needs to be said, because of the sort of the amount of debut fiction and the new and a writer's career is something to be cherished and celebrated, and always, I think, to be supported by one's publisher. So I think I'm glad this is here in book form.
Thank you.
Thank you. We just say thank you to each other. But yes, what would you like to? Should we talk about Maeve? Maybe you could ask a question of Helen, since you probably know the book very well.
Well, I think I'd love to say to you, Helen, that I feel you've done something extraordinary with this book, in that you've written about love, and you've written out of love and with love. And I think that's really extraordinarily difficult, the first one, because it's easy to topple over into sentimentality, isn't it? And there's a whole tradition of writing that's a bit fake and false, but very, very comforting. And you've completely avoided that, but you're still determinedly looking at love and what it means. And so you're exploring love, for example, with your two main protagonists, the man and the woman, who are married, and yet Maeve is having increasing problems. And what I think is so beautiful is that you show the love of the husband, Myrta, for his wife, and you show Maeve's attempts to love her children as well as she can. And so I think my question would be, do you think that Maeve's problems are partly to do with the fact that as a very young woman she gets married and she quickly becomes a mother, and she's suddenly having to be this person that our society says, on the one hand, sort of goddess, Virgin Mary, icon, Mother's Day mother, and on the other hand there's all these dark secrets the rest of the year of how do women actually cope. I mean, did you feel that there were sort of sociological circumstances affecting Maeve's difficulties? I felt there were, but I wondered what you thought.
Yes, I think so. I mean, something that dawned on me when I was reflecting on the role of the mother in the book, I looked up and I had written the word mother 125 times or something,
On one page.
Yeah, on one page. And Maeve arrives in Ireland in 1978, and in 1979 Pope John Paul stood up in the People's Mass in Limerick and appealed to the women of Ireland not to get distracted by jobs outside the home. And that their purpose was to raise their children and support their husbands. I mean, it's hard to overstate the impact of that on a nation, having, the Pope stand at the People's Mass and beseech of the women to take on their role. And that was the Ireland she arrived into. So, while Maeve had, the struggles she had with her mental health, and she was a creative person who was trying to work out, how she was going to manage those two things, and the sort of bright lights of the adrenaline that came with her performance, but her quieter internal struggles. Then when she found herself becoming a mother, that introduced a whole other question around her identity. And if Maeve could have read Michèle's book, I'm sure it would have been this incredible companion to her life, where she could understand that she could be like multiple versions of herself and find peace in the juxtaposition between those things. But I mean, at one point she says in the book that it's easier to be a mad mother, a dead mother, than a mad one. And I mean, such was the force of this iconic mother figure, which in some ways we feel is sort of uniquely Irish, but obviously isn't, of course. But it's so particularly strong and poignant in Ireland, where the only ways through life for women were to become a mother or a nun. There was no alternative, really. And so of course that would have been encroaching upon her. And I sort of deliberately made her American so that she could have that slightly otherness looking in at Irish motherhood, and be able to take it and look at it from that universal perspective, and not just from someone who'd grown up in the country, and see the impact that it would exert upon her, that external influence. But it's something I think a lot about. If she'd been born 5 years later, 10 years later, it's something I think about my own mother. My mother is 80, and I often look at her and think, what difference would 5 years have made, 10 years have made?
And yet what's so incredibly touching about your portrait of Maeve is she is a woman in struggle, but she's also, her struggles are full of gaiety sometimes, aren't they, and lightness, and she's very, very creative. And in fact, she's misunderstood sometimes by the villagers because she does things differently. It's partly being American, it's partly being an artist. And so you've created a very, very rounded picture, I think, of a woman. She's not just, as it were, a victim of the patriarchy. Not at all. No,
I'm so glad you think so. And I think, it just, when I was reading your memoir, I thought about Maeve again, and just how much of an absence there was for a whole generation of women, not having women like Michèle, who would give us this vision of what a colourful, amazing life could be, when you're in your 30s and your 40s and your 50s and your 60s and your 70s and your 80s, that there's no limit to any of this, and the texture and colour of your life, despite what society has told us as women for, centuries. And it's a remarkable thing. I think, even though it's called a diary of surviving, I just think it's really a diary of hope. It gives me so much hope for my future self and what my life could be like having read it. And I just wish Maeve could have had someone like Michèle in her life.
Well, that's right. And also there would have been a certain class of women that had a freedom, and there'd be a whole group of women who thought it wasn't for them to have expectations of, my mum grew up around the Elephant Castle in Peabody's, and she certainly didn't have high expectations of what she could achieve, because she was sort of working class. And I think that your book kind of crosses those assumptions of a writer being of a certain class as well, because you're everywhere. I mean, you're not, but you are. You're not. You don't feel like you belong to a particularly.
Well, that's very, very kind of. I'm sorry, I'm really rudely interrupting you.
That's all right. No, I'm glad you did. I was sort of coming to the end of my thought.
It's very kind of you to say that, because on the one hand, I have felt that as a writer you can live in different worlds, and perhaps you learn to pass, so I can exist in a quite posh world, perhaps because I went to university and met lots of posh people, and I could speak posh if I had to. Lots of women do that. And then in other worlds where I was living, when I was, I was very, very poor for a very long time, I always got on with the neighbours and found things we had in common and that we could talk about. So that was one thing. On the other hand, growing up, I had to check my privilege, definitely, class privilege, because I was from a family who could afford to helped me. When I was at university, which was free in those days, my parents could afford to. They never gave me money, but they might send me a packet of sandwiches or something. I mean, I did feel, in that sense, and I was white, and that was very much something you checked your privilege about. But I'm so delighted that you think a book like this could kind of travel around and talk to different people, because I am a Democrat and I am a socialist, and I do believe that art is for everybody, and it's not the fault of artists if ridiculous prices are put on paintings, or if galleries look forbidding. I think it's easier with books, actually, because we all know that public libraries are there, or well, they used to be. People could go into them, and bookshops like this are very welcoming. And I now live near the Elephant and Castle, near where you grew up, and my neighbours are working class people, and we talk about things. I mean, just because you're working class doesn't mean you haven't got a brilliant brain, and exactly. You're passionately interested in the issues of the day, and you've got a huge sense of humour. Oh wow! Anyway,
I think speech. you live your life in a way that is, I could just imagine the neighbours down your street sort of saying, well, there's Michelle, she's a writer, but she's a good laugh as well, so get her out, and and all of that. But enough of that. So talking about titles, both negative capability, I had never heard of before, and it's from Keats, isn't it? So it's from his letters, and you talk a lot about this, and it's because it's a great title for a book anyway, but you don't really think much about it until you explain in the book what it is. And you were saying before, weren't you? You think it's quite zeitgeisty.
Once again, Michelle is at the forefront of the thinking of the zeitgeist. Yes, I think since I read it, I feel like it's been popping up everywhere. Once again, the men have robbed Michelle's ideas and claimed it as their own.
Would you like to explain it a little bit? Or in
yeah, sure. I mean, I was really helped in the early days of my crisis and feeling lost and scattered and all over the place, coming across a volume of Keats's letters. And I think it's in 1816, around Christmas, he's describing walking home from the pantomime with two friends, possibly his brother, and he says he has these thoughts about how men of genius don't have very strong characters, because what they are is very open to just stuff coming in. So they're very receptive and very porous, and they're not great big macho, bullies at all. And he says, sort of Shakespeare and people like that. And then he goes on to elaborate this thought, I think a couple of days later, and says, I can't quote it exactly, but it's about not striving for rationality and being always right and reasonable and, as it were, getting to an opinion and a fixed notion of things. It's about this free floatingness. And it connected for me to a Buddhist idea, it's called the wisdom of insecurity. And it just really rescued me, that there I was floating in my rough sea. I mean, going around town having a jolly good time, because the book is about finding the joys of everyday life, yes. But I thought, well, I'm going to really try and just hang on to this notion of Keats's, that you don't have to know what's going to happen. You can't know what's going to happen most of the time. And you're not in control of things. And therefore, it's not always your fault if you feel miserable or lost or in a mess. It's okay. You just kind of float along. And I just felt very grateful to Keats, who spelt it out back in 1816.
He knew all about it. Yes, he said he was capable of being in uncertainties, and I found that really useful to be reading about, and comforting to hear that someone else was being able to just carry on, even though everything was extremely uncertain and in flux and unfixed. And I think there was your writing teacher, didn't she say to you when you were a young writer, that you just carry on?
That was my tutor at university, yes. Whatever horrors you might be reporting to your moral tutor, this wonderful woman, Rosemary Wolfe, would say, just get on with your work, Miss Roberts. But Helen, you see, what I thought I discovered was that I think as a writer I knew that you had to be in doubts, mysteries and uncertainties, because that's the writing process, isn't it? That we don't know how we'll get to the end of the chapter and we don't know how many drafts we're going to need. The difference for me was practicing that in my life. And one of the things I really loved in your novel was that I think Maeve gets lost in her doubts and uncertainties and mysteries, and she can't cope with them and just contain them. It's tragic for her. But Murta, I feel, he has a quality of soul that lets him go on living in doubts and mysteries and uncertainties, which means that at the end, something really beautiful happens for him. And I felt very much as a result of his being able to sort of let go of guilt and let go of angst and kind of be open to something new happening. Do you think that's an accurate reading?
It's a beautiful reading of it. I think I've been thinking a lot about this idea of not allowing yourself to get stuck in a moment, and that if you can keep yourself open to the idea, even the idea of moving forward, which is different from moving on, then that can lead you to kind of unexpected places. And I think what was remarkable about Murta in the end, as I got to know him better in the writing of it, was just that he had this capacity to allow his mind to be changed and to not feel the narrative of his life was totally fixed.
Yes.
And I think maybe that's, even though obviously Murta is the father in the family, I think that's probably something I got from my mother, because I've been endlessly amazed through my lifetime how things that I thought my mother was so staunch about when we were younger, she's just had the flexibility and the kind of emotional capacity to evolve and change with society and with the times and with the conversations she's had with us, and to be able to sit down, now that she's 80, and go, I used to think this, that and the other, but I now look at things totally differently. And I just think that's a remarkable trait of the human condition, and I think maybe that's why Murta was able to find, eventually, though it wasn't easy, a way to imagine a different kind of life for himself in Maeve's absence.
I did find his journey. It was after I finished the book. I can remember I put the book in my bedroom and I went to make a cup of tea, and I thought, I must go and just check on that man, and as if he was in the room, and I found it very
so
I mean, it's quite rare. Well, when it happens, when you read characters that are fully in your sort of world, then it's really working, and emotionally just so rich, and I mean, such an evocation of a great evocation of an island as well. I mean, I've never visited that place, but there's so much that we could discuss to do with the family. I recommend fully that you you out there read both books, but Willa has given us the nod. Can you believe it? It's flown by and we've still got so much to talk about. But yes, you can always tweet Helen if you have a question or a thought about Helen's book. I don't think you're on Twitter, are you?
No,
Michelle?
I was for a bit and then I stopped. It didn't suit me.
Yeah, no, it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
In fact, it's rarely for anyone most of the time. But anyway, I'd like to thank you both for coming, and please do, if you can, get a copy. You can get the copies from here. Going to get them signed, and I'd like to thank you again for coming out on a Monday night.
Thank you for having us.
Thursday night.
They can find you a book for your girlfriend, your husband, your girl or your boy. And if you've got a need for an uplifting read, Justine and Jonathan can pick out a book you'll enjoy. What a book at the Bookseller Crow on the hill. What a book at the Bookseller Crow on the hill.
Crystal Palace Hill it is. But you can order online.